Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 168. Well, stay tuned for a special interview this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy. We are not joined by my co-host, Pastor Todd Bordeaux, today, but we are joined by a special guest who I will be interviewing today, and that is Mike Beck. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Hey, Chris. Great to see you. Great to be part of this, and great to hear that jingle. And yeah, man, just to see you in action. It's incredible.
Yeah, I've been wanting to interview you for a while. I'm glad to have the opportunity. Todd wanted a week off, so we're going to give that to him and let Mike do the heavy lifting this episode.
Well, one man's loss is another man's gain. Thank you, Todd. Appreciate the opportunity.
That's right. There's lots of great stuff I could say about you, but I'd like our audience to hear from you. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yep. So I am a pastor of a church in New Zealand, in Wellington, Gracenet Community Church, and I've been doing that since, we came over from South Africa to plant the church with that goal. Came over with a team in 2005, and so we planted that and went through. It was quite a process to set things up, and then I eventually took over as the lead pastor in 2007, and yeah, it's been a slow build. It's been hard work. Wellington's an interesting place. I've once heard it described. I know a lot of your listeners are from the States, so maybe this will resonate with them. It's almost as if Portland and Seattle had a baby. That's Wellington right there. I think having gone to those places, I think that's a fairly accurate description. You've got like a little San Francisco vibe going on, and it's quite intense, quite progressive, it's got all the art and politics happening, and it's the capital of New Zealand, and so yeah, I mean, we were right there in the heart of the city, doing our thing, and it's trying to make sure that we're part of the Reformed Baptists, so we're confessional, and it's swimming upstream at that level, but it's just trying to keep it engaged as well, and not get too parochialized. Make sure that we're connected to what's going on in the city, and in so doing, it's been good. We've built up well. It's a healthy little church at this point. Still under the 100 mark. So after 15 years, that's kind of what you're looking at. But most churches are fairly small in New Zealand anyway, and so very different to the States in that regard. But yeah, it's going well, and just right now with the lockdown, of course, everything's a little bit different.
Right.
But we had you preaching for us. That was awesome. We took advantage of the time difference there, and got you to preach for us your Saturday night, our Sunday morning, and that was great. That was amazing. So things like that, we're trying to make best use of it, and hopefully we'll emerge from this when it's all finished. But we are trying to live stream our services at this point. Obviously it's a bit of a not at all what it could be. We're not taking communion or anything like that. Right. So I'm just trying to keep in touch with folks. But yeah, otherwise life goes on.
Yeah. Our longtime listeners probably know that Mike had me come out to a conference that he hosted on biblical theology, and I got to talk about some of the topics that we talk about on this podcast, and I did it there in Wellington. And so I can definitely, I can see that description that you gave of Wellington. I mean, yeah. Physically, it looks a lot like San Francisco with the hills and things like that. Culturally, I've not been to Portland, but from what I know of it and from what I know of San Francisco politically, it definitely seems that way.
Right.
And I think it would be important for our listeners to know whether New Zealand is like the United States in that there's a church on almost every corner here. Churches are a dime a dozen.
Right. Yeah. No, it's not. in a nutshell. I mean, there is. It's it's part of it's a Western country in that sense, and I suppose you've got your Western hangover and Christendom and whatnot has seeped in everywhere, and so you've got your churches, and people know what church is, and it's not that far gone. I often get people from the States kind of phone me up and I'm part of a few different organizations, so with missions and whatnot, and they'll want to come and do missions in New Zealand. And they approach it as if it's almost like do people speak English there, and how will I interact with the tribes, and what's going to go on there, and so it's not at all like that, but I would say almost a European, if anyone's ever been to Europe, you have that kind of vibe, I think, going on, in that it's very, there is a post-Christian, long-forgotten sort of understanding. When there's a church around, it's probably very, very liberal. All the mainline denominations are extremely liberal. And when I say liberal, I mean like crazy liberal. And then when you've got your conservative church, it's few and far between. And when I say conservative, I'm meaning just basically holding on to inspiration of the scriptures, the deity of Christ, the Trinity. I mean, really basic stuff. Yeah. But just when you find something, it's probably pretty hard shelled. It's probably quite withdrawn. They've had to be so sort of tough around the edges. It's usually 2 or 3 people gathered in a huddle kind of thing. And I'm over emphasizing that or over exaggerating that, but that's the picture. The churches that are conservative tend to be small and withdrawn, and so not very healthy, is one way to put it. Unfortunately, I mean, it's a little bit better in the Reformed churches. I think they've got a long. You don't have a lot of Reformed churches like in our whole greater region. The Dutch Reformed, they don't like to be called Dutch, but the truly Reformed guys, they're about three churches over the whole greater region. Some of them are okay. Some of them are a little bit hard-shelled in that sense as well. None of them too big. So, very different to the picture from the States. And then, unfortunately, the kind of Christianity that perhaps is most prospering at this point is almost like a spillover from the Hillsong Australia scene. We've got a very, very energetic, shall we say, charismatic scene going on. Now, the good thing is that they're not liberal, and there's that, and I suppose there is an element of holding on to some doctrine there, but it's almost like New Zealand never had that Puritan backbone. South Africa had it at some level. It had that Dutch Huguenot influence and the Calvinism. So whatever craziness evolves in South Africa, it's always got this backbone of Reformed and Calvinistic thinking, which I think just keeps preaching a big thing. So people always care about preaching, and people always, there's just something there that preserves or conserves doctrine for all the trouble it's caused by way of apartheid and all of that. At least there's that. Whereas New Zealand, it's really never taken hold at that level. If anything, you've had these very way out charismatic revival sort of things happen with Smith Wigglesworth and so forth, and just really bizarre scenarios coming through town, and the thing that's really gripped the Christianity there is either that extreme form of charismatic theology on the one hand, or a very, very withdrawn, almost closed brethren kind of dispensational thinking, hard-shelled conservative fundamentalist thinking, or as I said, the liberal thought is probably the most that's within the mainstream of the way people think here. So, and that's just really a social gathering of some sort, with some spirituality attached to it, usually quite involved with the, progression of, various agendas. I'll leave it at that at this point.
Okay.
But yeah, so that's the basic layout. So to try and hold a middle line there, or there's a lot of work to do. Let's put it that way. Often, if people are thinking about coming to New Zealand, which I'm always encouraging, that they do. If people are thinking about ministry in New Zealand, I always tell them, hey, pick a spot, get to work. There's no worry even to, you don't even have to spend any more time thinking about where you want to go or what would be strategic or anything like that. You just have to pick a spot, get to work, and that'll be fine, So
I got to meet some of your friends at the conference, so I know that there are other believing churches in New Zealand. It sounds like each of those churches need to kind of rely on each other for support and strength and encouragement and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we're part of the Fellowship of Reformed Baptist. Again, it's about 10 churches, not even that at this point, I think. So very small. All the churches are small, but we are, we treasure each other. It really is. And there's a very real fellowship that is, when the guys get together, it's real. there's a real sense of, all right, we're taking a bit of a rest together in the trenches, and I think everyone feels that it's a difficult gig in New Zealand. You get out there and you're honestly swimming against the stream on everything, just everything that you're standing for, and so it takes its effect. And then we're also sort of as a broader initiative just to kind of help see churches planted and within a bigger tent framework, so to speak, just to, I suppose I've always wanted to keep it more or less in the Calvinistic-ish thing, rather than just get too involved with broad generic mission organizations, which, I feel personally like, what are we doing at that level? Sometimes, I'm just too much of an idealist. So Acts 29 has provided for us a helpful way to sort of see some churches move forward, and, whether they be Presbyterian, Anglican, it doesn't matter. You basically are just holding on to a sound gospel, and obviously you've got a lot of differences even in Calvinistic thought, but it's just a way to resource some of the stuff that we do together. It's a way to just kind of push it forward. And so I've been very involved in that as well. I've been the regional director for Acts 29 in New Zealand for a while. I've actually just recently handed that over to Anthony. You might have met him when you were down. But just with all the other stuff going on at the moment, I thought it'd be better to do that before I drop everything that I'm juggling. And so I'm excited for what'll happen there. He's a good guy.
Great. Well, I know it's not a revelation to you that you are on a podcast about Meredith Kline and his theology. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how Kline has influenced you and how you read the Bible.
Oh, man. Yeah. It's like, was I even reading the Bible before I was reading Kline? That's the question. Kline, that's an interesting one. I think what happened was, in terms of the way, you plant a church, and in hindsight, and I've written an article on Gospel Coalition. If anyone does want to check it out, just briefly telling the story on this. But we planted too soon. In hindsight, the theological training was not as robust as it should have been at a few different levels. But part of, you think you've got it together, you plant the church, and then you have to preach every week, and stuff comes up fast and furiously, and you're dealing with the very, very gritty messiness of life immediately, and it's not the glamour you thought it would be, and you're eyeballing everyone every Sunday with your own insecurities and your own failures. And that sort of formed quite a strong catalyst in terms of having to make sure that our doctrine was secure enough to handle all of that, and just to preach consistently through the Bible is just a thing on its own. Now I realize that those coming to that with the luxury of a 3-year sort of reform training, MDiv or 4-year training, will be a lot more confident in that regard, and they'll have organized these things already. But I think most seminary education, 3-year programs really won't leave you with any degree of coherence in terms of your understanding. You might have covered the basics of systematic theology. You might have, done your intro and this and that. But in terms of, actually seeing the Bible as a cohesive whole and preaching it from beginning to end, and that was one thing that we wanted to be committed to, just, systematic expository preaching, book by book. So again, sounds good until you actually start doing it. And if you don't have the ability to piece these things together and see how they all fit together, it ends up becoming a terrifying process, especially when that next week's coming right at you real quick. And then you just get done with that, and you're wondering how you even made it through that Sunday, and the next one's coming at you already. And so it sent me back to the books, essentially, to cut a long story short. And just trying to find how it all worked, together was the big quest there. Beyond a maturing and understanding of covenant theology, or at least Reformed theology, and seeing a great help in covenant theology. I think there were a lot of unanswered questions for me, a lot of things that didn't quite fit, and a lot of things that I think other systems were kind of getting right, but not getting right. And so it's just obviously anyone who's looked at this knows that it's a very big subject, very confusing, lots of moving parts. And so to read Kline, which I think I got into via Lee Irons or Jason Stellman, who was still, active, let's say, at that point. But one of the two, I can't remember exactly, but I started, just getting into the source material behind what I saw to be a helpful working model. And yeah, I was blown away. I should also say, actually, while I'm talking, I'm remembering the other big thing while I'm wrestling with how to preach the Bible was really how to relate what I was preaching to culture. And it really becomes intensified when you're in New Zealand, because it's, you have to figure out how this works. How are you going to stay sane? What is okay? What is legitimate? What isn't? What do we need to be striving for? Is there a goal that we all have to, be on in terms of transformation of the city? Is it, that's certainly the popular talk, but, maybe that works in terms of the States or something, a similar culture. Maybe it worked well even in South Africa, but you come to New Zealand or a place in Europe or something, you realize you're not going to transform anything. Let's just be, you're not getting into politics real soon. You're definitely not going to be, turning any city into a basically Christian city. So, it's all that sort of stuff is hitting you in the face. And you have to be able to process that. And, of course, you have your basic Christ and culture paradigms to work with there. But yeah, they just, they weren't quite fitting quite as well as I'd hoped. And there was a bit of angst there as well. Let's put it that way. So I'm working with two things by the time I come to Kline. And these are the two major, burdens really at this point that I'm carrying. And I'm trying to set it up so that you understand, so that when I started reading Kingdom Prologue, honestly, it's like my mind was blown, that just to understate that tremendously. I just felt like not only just these deep riches of the kind of Reformed theology that I'd been looking at, and just the exegetical backing for that, but also the biblical theological sort of edge that sometimes is missing from Reformed theology, or more, perhaps some of the older covenant formulations. And so you have all of that. You have the application of those things to culture. So not only was it showing me how it all fit together in just paradigm shifting ways, but it was forming a paradigm for being able to engage with culture and to do what I come to do to New Zealand to plant the church. So, with the whole understanding of how the church works and the redemptive kingdom, and yet, just to know that we are essentially like a Sethite community right back there in the beginning, working amongst the Canaanite cities. And it was just, I use that reference because that's fairly early on in Kingdom Prologue that he brings that up. And that's kind of how quickly that it hooked me. So yeah, I went on from Kingdom Prologue just to kind of read it all at that point, just to work my way through all of Kline's stuff. at some level or another. Reading is a relative term. So, I looked at the page and was confused for a large part of some of the books. That's a better expression for what I did. But, you know how it works. At some point you'll get it. And then you're like, wow, that's amazing. And then you realize, oh, I don't got it anymore. And then wait a minute, I got it again. Wait a minute. And so that was the process for me. For a while, sort of reread Kingdom Prologue and, came back to it. But yeah, I've been hooked ever since, essentially. And I feel like, now if anyone had to ask me what has been the most, influential to the way I preach, the way I approach every single Sunday, well, just without a doubt, anyone who knows me will know that it's Kline. In fact, my brother said the other day, cut him and he bleeds Kleinian. Well, it's kind of true. That's how I am at this point. And certainly on the subject of missions and church planning and cultural engagement and, politics. All of that is just straight out of Kline's thinking for me.
Wow, that's great. So he sounds like he really helped you understand how the Bible all fits together. Instead of, I grew up thinking that, it was just a bunch of stories that weren't connected to each other in any way, but he helped you with that. And then also how to understand and relate to the culture around you.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't grow up as a Christian, during those sorts of a year. I imagine I can totally resonate with when people say that. I've seen the Sunday school pictures. Right. I've seen, when I say Sunday school, I don't mean the adult class. I mean the kids' church thing. I realize that's a bit of a lost in translation thing sometimes there. But the kids' pictures. There's Noah and the rainbow. Here's the Abrahamic covenant. Here's this, and you're coloring in this picture and coloring in that picture, and that's your Sunday school experience essentially. And it's a small wonder that you wouldn't see any connection at all. It seems like a random collection of stories. But, for me, I came into it probably around, 20 years old, after really not moving in that direction at all. I was not a Christian and no intention of moving in that goal. I'll save that story for some other time. But basically, I had to take it very seriously. I remember reading the whole Bible and just one of the things, interestingly, looking back on it, that has formed me on this is that it was obvious to me, although I knew I didn't understand it, I knew that I was getting lost, especially, you kind of track with the story from Genesis all the way to like the end of Ezra, maybe at a stretch. And then it just goes like, what are we even doing? What is going on? How does this all fit in? And then you feel like you're right out of air until you get to, Matthew, and then you read about it again, and then you read about it again, and then you read about it again in John, and then you're like about to give up again. And then, all of a sudden it starts getting explained for you in Romans. And so, I remember very lucidly going through that process and just trying to stick with the story. And I didn't understand a lot of it, but I remember coming through thinking, this is one big idea. This is one, even with that disconnectedness, by the time I got to Revelation, I remember sitting in the nightclub and there was all this trance music playing. I was managing a nightclub at the time. We were waiting during the day, and we were restocking the bars. Well, I won't mention it. I know this might get fragile, but anyways, basically, there I am doing my usual gig, and I'm reading the book of Revelation. It was the last book of the Bible, and I got through the whole thing. And you got the dragon and this trance music playing, and it was just a very, very trippy experience. But I remember, that's how little I understood, right? But I remember thinking, wow, so look, it has all been about Jesus, and look what he did. I remember closing the book and thinking that. Wow. So it never really, whenever I came across any system of theology that wanted to rip that story apart, it fell flat. It did feel like I couldn't accept it, but the problem was I didn't have anything that I knew how to build it with, and so That was really the frustration. I was sort of stuck in limbo for a long time. And you look at the various options, and I suppose they give you some semblance of coherence, but there's something more there essentially. There's all these little parts that aren't accounted for, and I think that's where Kline comes in. He just shows you how it all fits in, every single part, and at least gives you the tools that you need to do your own thinking on it. A starting point at least.
Right. That's great. So now 15 years into pastoral ministry?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You've got something big on your plate that involves Kline's influence, don't you?
Yes, I do. Yeah. I am doing a PhD on Meredith Kline. So it's sort of like confessing that you're an alcoholic, you know? Hi, I'm Michael. I'm doing a PhD on Kline. So yeah, there's that. And I've just actually finished the third chapter, which is like to provide a working knowledge of Kline's thought. And I just realized how suicidal this whole thing is. Like, what was I thinking? You know, how on earth does anyone do this? It's impossible. But anyways, I'm going for it. And I have moments of encouragement along the way. And there are moments of deep, just like, what am I doing? But yeah, it is essentially about the two kingdoms and Kline's thought as it undergirds that. So just basically wanting to, to look at those things. It all started actually when I was, obviously you get into VanDrunen and you start reading his stuff, and then the debate follows, and then you see the viciousness of some of those debates, and I was just following one of the threads on that, and what was the guy's name? I think it was Ben Miller or something along those lines. He was just writing one critique on the two kingdom thing, and he made this comment that one thing that just really hasn't received much attention is the whole biblical theological undergirding for the Two Kingdom Project by way of the exegesis and theology of Meredith Kline, the covenant theology of Meredith Kline, and so I thought, that's interesting. That seems crazy that hasn't been done, and then I, following soon after that. I was reading through an article by John Wind, who was basically, again, just kind of trying to reconcile VanDrunen and some of his opponents, some of the neo-Calvinists. And, great article. He was just saying, listen, at a functional level, you probably are looking at quite a strong overlap in terms of what neo-Calvinists are saying in their moderate forms and what VanDrunen's saying. And really some of the disagreements at that endpoint functional level are quite superficial. But what remains a fundamental divide is the undergirding covenant theology involved in the neo-Calvinist position and the two kingdom position. And again, so I just thought, this is something that probably needs to be looked at. I wanted to, so I thought I'll write up a proposal, see how that goes, submit it, see if there was something to work with there, and it got accepted. And so basically, the idea is just to take Kline's covenant theology and say, firstly, to what degree is it actually connected to the Two Kingdom Project? Have they stopped? Has VanDrunen, for example, gone past Kline? Has he been in sync with Kline? Has he come? Is he building on Kline or isn't he? Let's just make all that lucid, and then secondly, to subject Kline's substructure and his thought to some scrutiny. And by way of a dialectic, so it's all interacting with neo-Calvinists, and in the process determine whether there is something that is in fact legitimate there, and then beyond that to try and put some options on the table for getting past the impasse that sometimes emerges. So all of those things are there, and it's quite a journey.
Yeah, I can relate, having done a PhD myself. I know that roller coaster ride where you have those days of victory, but then you also have those days of, what have I done?
What have I done? This is stupid. This is the worst idea ever. Exactly. But
your project sounds exciting, and I really look forward to having you back on. Maybe even before, but definitely once it's finished, to hear how your thought has all come together on this. But I always feel the need to point out to audiences that the language of Two Kingdoms was not Kline's. He really didn't talk that way. We talk that way today because of the influence of David VanDrunen, right? But he was a student of Meredith Kline's, and whenever you read anything by VanDrunen, I don't see how you can miss Kline's influence in there.
No.
But Kline talked more about the distinction between a particular covenant that he called the covenant of common grace, and then the covenant of grace that we at least in Reformed circles, tend to talk more about, just because that's where we find ourselves as Christians. Although Kline would say we even have a foot in the common grace world as well. So, yeah. How far along are you in the project?
I think at the end of this month, hopefully, about halfway.
Which means you
say that with a dash of optimism, at least.
Right. Question mark in the voice there.
Yeah.
How many chapters have you written?
So this will be the end of the third chapter. There are 8 chapters in total, but I think the beasts are sort of wrangled to the ground at this point. The first 2 were these beastly chapters, and I feel like once that's over, it's kind of downhill. So I'm hoping that's the case. Anyway,
right?
It might turn out to be otherwise, but yeah. So, anyways, probably around halfway, even though there are 8 chapters.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you talked earlier about how Kline helped you as a pastor understand how to understand the culture in New Zealand and to relate to that. What is the culture in New Zealand like? And can you talk about Kline's common grace and New Zealand culture?
Yeah, I mean, well, maybe I'll just reverse those 2 and just start with Kline and then move on to New Zealand.
Okay.
But I think with, as you say, it's kind of like Kline doesn't, at all. I mean, he hints at it. He's got these, like you think of his report on medical missions, for example. It's basically anticipation of what Horton will write in Gospel Mission and, that even where in the world is the church, at these, these popular level books that are basically just expanding on what Kline started to say there. So yeah, there's a definite connection, and you see in VanDrunen, it's unavoidable. Even though I don't know if you've seen the new book that VanDrunen put out.
No.
Popped into I had it on pre-order. It popped into my Kindle list there, and it's Politics After Christendom. So it's this kind of summary capstone, book, which is great. I'm halfway through it now. It's excellent. But there again, I mean, he's using terms like refraction, talking about the common grace cultural mandate. I mean, that's just, as far as I'm aware, that's Kline, right? That's the only one who speaks that way. And so what I think, having looked at it, I mentioned, I don't know if your listeners will know that, but we run and you're often a guest on the podcast I run, which is the 2-Age Sojourner. But we've recently had Lee Irons on, and we've talked through a whole bunch of things there. But one of the things that came up was this issue of the 3 layers of the law. And I think you guys actually did a podcast on this a while back, an episode on this a while back, where essentially Lee walks us through the development of law and gospel from its medieval period, essentially, all the way through to its more mature covenantal reform reflections. And I think, as I was reading that, I realized, there is something very similar going on with Kline in the 2 kingdoms.
Right.
In that you've got even though Kline doesn't talk about the 2 kingdoms, I mean, if you just think about the greater history of thought, and just prior to Kline and all the way from the beginning, you've got this paradigm going on as people try and work these things out. I'm thinking Augustine's 2 cities, Galatius's 2 swords, and just all the way through. There's always some sort of wrangle on this, and basically, you have this synthesis of law and gospel, but it's also true that there was this one kingdom kind of synthesis right throughout Christendom. And it took various forms, and there's again ways to try and work that out. Like you think of the 2 sword thing, they're just trying to work out, okay, well, who gets authority over what over here in this one kingdom? To what degree does the monarch need to submit to the Pope? And it's all operating within that one kingdom Christendom rubric. But it's a kind of 2 kingdom paradigm in the sense that there are 2 different dimensions being wrestled with. And then Luther comes along, and of course he breaks it open with the law gospel thing. And he goes, listen, these things are antithetical. And so, faith and works and justification, and the Reformation essentially comes from that. But it's interesting that his other thing that happened there was the two kingdom thought, and the two are connected, because basically he saw the administration of law and gospel take place through these two kingdoms. So he would have the law being, and now I use administered, but basically he's thinking about the outer kingdom, the kingdom of this world, the left-hand kingdom. It's all law in his mind. And then gospel is all that inward kingdom, the right-hand kingdom, the kingdom in which we're justified, the kingdom that, is really spiritual and invisible and before God, coram Deo, not coram mundi. And so there's all of that starts to go hand in hand with his law-gospel antithesis. And then Lee goes on and talks about the way that, the Reformed guys were really not content to leave it as timeless, abstract law, gospel principles. They wanted to make sure to connect it to the way they saw it in Scripture by way of the law as a covenant, the gospel as a covenant of grace, the law as a covenant of works. And that starts to develop, as we know, in covenant theology. And a similar thing happens with the kingdoms again. You basically have the two kingdoms come along in Calvin's thought, and he's not, he basically takes on the same sort of Lutheran thing, except that he's not happy to leave law just completely outside in the outer kingdom, adiaphora, kind of, we'll just leave that there. He wants to bring it in. He wants to see it in an eschatological, institutional kind of community in the church, the place where the kingdom of God is already manifest at some level. And so the kingdom, and there is law and gospel, there's command and there's promise, and this is all administered through what he's understanding to be the covenant of grace and its beginnings in terms of the history of the development of covenant theology. And then this keeps going in post-Reformation. It just gets more and more mature. And what's amazing about it to me is that wherever you see a development of covenant theology, it really does serve as an undergirding to what happens as people try and consider two kingdoms or the Christ and culture question more broadly. Whenever you see something happen with the covenants, you're going to see it happen or take its outworking in the way that people view culture. So, I mean, the Kuyperian thing, obviously, you've got some covenantal developments going on over there, and that comes through in terms of a distinct Kuyperian approach to culture. You've got even just the way that the Reformed, almost like what would you call it, like a theocratic, magisterial two-kingdom view develops. Again, it's very associated to what's going on in their view of the Mosaic covenants, and then the Puritans I don't have to tell you about, and you've got the whole Puritan experiment thing. But again, you've got the undergirding debate going on. What's going on with the Mosaic covenant? What's happening with law and grace? And so it's almost unsurprising at that level that by the time you get to Kline, and even if just before Kline we wanted to say there's a kind of a split of the two streams from Voss onwards, you've got almost like the Voss through Murray down to Bonson, maybe it just moving all in that direction. It's unsurprising that you're going to have theocracy and theonomy and those debates, and Christian Reconstructionism come from that. But on the other side, Voss moving through to Kline, it's almost unsurprising then that you'll have the Two Kingdom project emerge from VanDrunen. And really all that is, in much the same way as the attempt has been to take the law, gospel, timeless abstract principles and attach them to the covenant historical setup of Scripture. That's all that's happening here with the idea of the two kingdoms. They're all they're wanting to do is say, let's rejuvenate our tradition by taking these what have been viewed in timeless abstract principles, maybe through that gate that Luther sort of opened up for everyone. And let's make sure to attach this to its covenant historical sort of outworking. And doing that has been difficult, and obviously it has led to all these different versions. But when you start getting, if you think Kline is the cutting edge and of where we should be covenant in terms of covenant theology, then it's the next step there is almost to go, all right, well, let's make sure we're taking these two kingdom principles and tying them into Kline's covenant theology, or at least seeing a doctrine emerge from it. It's what has always been happening. And so I think even though Kline doesn't mention it, it's sort of inevitable outworking at that greater level. And I think that, that resonates deeply with me, because that's exactly, even though, it's all happening at a very personal level when I get into Kline. I mean, not only am I learning to see how the Bible fits together by way of an understanding of covenant theology, but the very next thing that's happening to me is I'm feeling like I can actually understand how to then, live in the world as a citizen of heaven, and how I can be a minister of the church and fully engaged in the mission of the church, and yet also live as one who seeks the peace of the city in New Zealand, and understand where those boundaries are, where that cultic boundary is, to use Kline's term, and to know where the burden lies for me. What do I need to be burdened by? What do I need to be liberated in? It all flows out of that covenant theology. So I suppose that's kind of a long answer to the first part of that. But in terms of the way that then works out to New Zealand, it's essential, because in New Zealand, I think you'll get very, very discouraged. I mean, I've seen one of two things happen, and I don't think a lot of people have. It's one of the reasons I wanted to write this dissertation, because I hope people will read it in New Zealand. I hope pastors will read it, or at least a popular version of it, and just be encouraged by it, because I think you've got one of two things going on. You've got at one level people just going, almost like taking a dispensational fundamentalist view and just saying, listen, look, it's all going down. It's all, we're getting raptured soon anyway. So really, let's just hold on for dear life. I mean, if you just 5 minutes on any news episode or broadcast, and you're going to be totally discouraged in seeing what's going on. There's absolutely no hope of coming back with a Christian sort of yesteryear Brady Bunch sort of thing. It's not coming back. It's gone forever. It's basically the message that comes through. That whole Christian thing is gone. It's over. It's dead in New Zealand. We're back in New Testament times and worse, is the feeling that you get. So if you were hoping that your only ability to engage with culture was, if they were somewhat Christianish, or at least adhered to somewhat Judeo-Christian ethics, then you're just going to retreat, and you're just going to hold on for dear life. And that's exactly what they've been doing. They've just been retreating in their churches, in their jobs. I mean, even just at work, they'll do their work, but the only way to actually redeem work in their minds is by doing some evangelism there or something like that. But really, it's just get out of work as soon as you can and just retreat again. I'm overstating things at some level, but to try and make the point. And then, of course, you've got on the other side people going, well, let's just roll up our sleeves and let's get stuck in. If we can only really live in a world and make it legitimate for ourselves as Christians, that if it's kind of Christianish, then let's just try and get stuck in and actually change it. If not at a political level, then really at our level of social action or something along those lines. And that works well for the liberal side of things, and certainly that has taken root in New Zealand. But to be able to think of a very, very hostile toward Christianity place as a legitimate realm is it's almost, no one thinks that way,
right?
And we need to, because that will make us. It'll encourage us. Number one, that the wheels aren't going to fall off. In fact, God has been preparing the church for ever since the fall. Pretty much, this has been actually what's going on, and this is what God's people have always had to live in, and they're okay. They can do it. Persecution even comes, but God's people are sustained through this, and then. In terms of mission itself, like almost like the world is lifted from your shoulders, in that your job is to not turn the city of man into the city of God. Your job is to preach the gospel and to administer the sacraments, and to make sure that you're pastoring the flock, and I'm thinking obviously from a pastor's perspective, but then even from those in the church, their job is to go out and take their vocation seriously, and to work to the glory of the Lord, and to consider that refracted cultural mandate with seriousness. There is a stewardship entrusted to them there. They can work with a satisfaction and a joy, and receive some level of It is important. It's not just something that's, unless they're basically going into ministry, they have no meaning or worth there. I mean, it's quite the opposite. All of their vocational sort of dignity is restored to them, and yet they're able with all of their heart to see what's going on and why the church needs to take priority in terms of that missional aspect, and the local church being front and center in that. So, I mean, look, even as I'm talking, I'm realizing there are about 300 million things we're not saying here, and so many things to go into. But, that's kind of a sketch of why I feel this is essential in New Zealand. It's a landscape that will not allow for anything else at this point. And so to have a theology that equips you well for it I couldn't think of anything more important.
Wow. Okay, so what then is the need like for the gospel in New Zealand? I mean, what kinds of numbers of people are we talking about, and how many would you say have heard the gospel? How many have yet to hear it?
Yeah, I mean, you've got like a post-Christian thing going on again.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, what happens there is, you'll talk to people. Let me just take a step back before getting into New Zealand. Here's a good illustration that I think works well, to illustrate what's going on here. Imagine you're setting off and you're a missionary and you come across an unreached people group, what a glory, right? There you are, you're doing your missionary thing. This is amazing. Now you've learned the language, you're ready for action, you want to communicate the gospel. You've got all sorts of things going on that get in the way, but they're unique to that situation. In other words, you have to overcome communication barriers. That's a problem, but it's doable. You can train for it. There you are. Your big thing is to just make sure to communicate the gospel faithfully, and to help them to understand what's going on and how this all applies to them. And anyway, so that's basically your first up sort of missionary reaches unreached people group thing. But there's another situation that this is often faced, and that's when you set off on your missionary journey and you reach the unreached people group, in some far corner of the earth, and except someone reached them before, right? You start communicating the gospel, and the chief says to you, "Oh, actually, yeah, we remember this. This is a while back. We kind of kicked that guy out, but we remember this. You're preaching Jesus, and basically that means we have to dress like Puritans and wave a British colonial flag, or we remember what Jesus is about. It's about British colonial flags, and that kind of thing. So then your job as a missionary is not to just only worry about preaching the gospel clearly in this new context, but to make sure you're doing it in such a way that's undoing, or at least forcing them to see that what they have heard before, what they previously understood as Christianity, is in fact not Christianity. So you have to perhaps wear the tribal gear and the tribal garb and prove that you don't dress like a Puritan or something,
Right.
Something. I'm kind of, you can tell I'm making this up as I go,
Yeah.
right? But basically, you have to do something maybe a little bit taboo to smoke the peace pipe, whatever it is, just to show that, hey, what you thought you knew about what I'm saying is not necessarily the case. So give me another shot and let me communicate this thing properly. And so, all to say, you come to New Zealand, you've got this post-Christian hangover thing going where there'll be some in New Zealand that, they might have, as young children or as children, come up in a very staunch, almost closed brethrenish household, or very fundamentalist or whatever. And for them, the gospel is don't go to the disco, or women can't wear pants, or, whatever it is. Just, we've got it. We know what it is. The gospel is that turn or burn guy on the street that we saw when we were young, or whatever it is. So you basically have to come along and you have to say, all right, whatever you, and it's by the way you look. I'm filled with tattoos. I do all these things. Half of it is just trying to make use of the culture where we are living in the most tattooed place on the earth, So that's worth saying, just in case anyone's stumbling over that. But basically it shows that, hey, the thing that you thought you knew about me as a Christian pastor, you have to just give me another shot here. You have to just, and that's exactly what happens. They'll start making friends with someone, and then And then as soon as they hear you're a Christian, I mean, you can see the gates closed. But if you've done your work, and it's almost like they have cemented one fact in their minds, like you are definitely not a Christian by the way you dress, by the way you look, by the way, you've engaged with them. And then they realize that you're a Christian. You can see the confusion. They want to shut the gates, but they already have opened the gates. And so that's what you're looking for in New Zealand. You're wanting an opportunity to just go, okay, well, I know you want to shut the gates on me, but you might be shutting the gates on something you don't even know is Christianity. So you have to be able to try and get in there. And that's really what we're looking at. That's for some. And then for others, it'll be as simple as, I remember going around the equivalent year of Hate Street in San Francisco. It's called Cuba Street. You've been there.
Just
a crazy street. And I remember talking to people about the gospel and just we did that every Friday night. And everything I've just been saying, you see that kind of over and over again. But then the other thing is, people will hear that you're a Christian and they'll know what Christianity is in a very broad sense. Like they'll know, oh, well, Christian, that's a cultural form, perhaps. Some people, and I've heard this, will say, usually the younger generation, they'll be like, that's that bloke who died on the cross, right? Or that Jesus movie that came out, The Passion or something. So something like that will trigger it. So it shows the very superficial knowledge that they have. And so that's what you're looking at. Yeah. And that's, there's not a lot of nominalism in New Zealand. If you're a Christian, you probably mean business. That's the good news. The churches are small, but they pack a punch because, you got 10 people there that they're not scoring any points from society by being with you on Sunday. It's not at all helping them in any part of their lives, in any normal way, but they are there because they believe in Jesus. So it's amazing what you can do with 10 people like that. I remember talking to people from America. I remember we were about 20 people and we were fully self-sustaining already just because everyone's giving and everyone's involved and invested and giving of their lives. And a lot of guys from America couldn't believe that, thought we must be cheating somehow. But really it's just that's the good news of this, in that, once you get someone in, they have to be in. They want to be in all the way. So I like that. Coming from South Africa, you got a lot of Christian nominalism and a lot of people that you just kind of similar to the States, in that everyone thought they were a Christian essentially, and you have to. It's almost like your ministry becomes, no, you're not a Christian. Which is a very negative ministry. It's a bit tiring after a while. So it was quite refreshing to come to New Zealand where you don't ever have to say that really. If anything, you're just trying to equip Christians and dealing with this true but small response to the gospel.
Wow, that's I don't know if our audience is taking it that way, but to me that's exciting. I get tired of the situation that I find myself in just because of the phenomenon that you just described, where there's so much baggage that you have to sift through before you can actually have a conversation. Whereas it sounds like you're living in a very different culture, in a very different situation. And I know that, sorry, did you want to say something else?
No, and I think, again, I think the parallel to maybe like, parts of Canada, maybe Quebec or Europe, I think there's a good analogy or parallel there to what's going on in New Zealand right now, from what I've heard and what I've seen. Okay. So maybe in those situations will resonate.
Well, I know that we have a lot of listeners who are in seminary or maybe are freshly out of seminary. And so part of the evil genius behind inviting you on was to hopefully provoke some of those folks to think about New Zealand as a possible place to do pastoral ministry. So I hope that what you've said whets their appetite in that regard. But if someone wanted to reach out to you, how would they do that? And if they wanted to follow what you're up to, how would they do that?
Yeah. Well, let me warn them. If you reach out to me, you can get a William Farrell or however you pronounce it. I'm gonna tell you that the condemnation of New Zealand falls on your shoulders if you don't come down. No, I'm just kidding. It won't be that bad. But I will, very much encourage anyone to at least think about it, because certainly, I mean, in things like the Reformed Baptist world, you have open pulpits, as you do in the Presbyterian world, as you do in well, we don't actually have a lot of Lutherans, to be honest, but I think in any of those denominations, there will what you typically have is the main line, and then you have a breakaway, which is trying to kind of hold it together, and so within those breakaway movements, I mean, it's just, as I said earlier, pick a spot, get to work, plant a church. If there isn't a church, start a church. If there is a church, see what you can do. If it's dying, try and get it back together again. It's just a lot of work to do like that. So I suppose if anyone is thinking in those terms, feel free to reach out to me. Absolutely. I mean, you can get hold of me via. I think probably the easiest way is just if you go to the Gracenet church website. So that's gracenet.co.nz. That will have all the contact details you need to get to me. And just go ahead and do that. Don't even hesitate. It's difficult though. And what I have found talking to guys coming from America is that although the prospects might not be great in terms of ministry, they typically are better than you'll find in New Zealand. In that, it's the exchange rate is not quite as good. And so if you got seminary debt, you're going to take on a small church and get this really terrible pay. And, it's one of the reasons I hate seminary debt so much, because it stops people from doing that kind of thing. But it's a tough gig. So, it's not for the faint-hearted, I don't think, but it's a real need. And, what a glorious thing to be able to meet up in 10 years on this podcast. Hope it's still going by then, but, imagine saying, hey, we've got a whole bunch more churches,
right?
And, people that are equipping people to, from a Kleinian perspective as well. I mean, it's one thing to say, certainly we want to see gospel preaching churches, but we know that there's a lot that people need to be able to live in the truths of the gospel, and to be free in those truths, and also to be able to be effective in those truths. And so that's where I think Klein and that Kleinian perspective and theological education, I think can be of real benefit to New Zealand. And if people are coming from seminaries that have given them that, amen, even more so.
Excellent. Okay, so I will definitely link to the website that Mike just mentioned on the show notes. And I know you mentioned earlier the podcast that you host that you are kind enough to have me on frequently. You want to tell people about that real quick?
Well, it's just the attempt to make the world a more Kleinian place. It's just joining the effort. Worldwide. No, it came from when you were down, really. Remember when you were down in New Zealand? I think we were after one of the sessions, we were talking about it and saying, well, let's just start another one. And I just thought, what a crazy idea. Let's just do it. And I think one of the things that I've wanted to do, I know you guys are pretty set on working through Klein. It's niche. It's helpful in that regard. It's you've got all these Jedis that are getting on and working us through, helping us to understand Klein. That's great. I suppose I've wanted to try and just cover something from a more relaxed, informal, conversational perspective that covers almost every angle. So we try and get deep on Klein every now and again, but then just I have a few guys on regularly, and they're all pastors, and just to have those normal pastoral conversations, I suppose, that I was having anyway, which I always found were very helpful for me personally. And I've always just thought it'd be helpful. I don't know why. I just feel like I get into some really good conversations with these guys, and I always come away really blessed. I thought, let's just put, if nothing else, just put that on there if anyone's interested. But then even more so to relate a Kleinian perspective. in the broadest possible way. And so I've gone for this two-age sojourning kind of theme, 2 ages even, just to make it that much broader than the covenant theology itself. So, the breadth is the goal there. It's so broad it might be absolutely meaningless as people get. That's the downside of all of this. We have not got a niche, but anyways, it's usually interesting for people who are just keen to fill up with another podcast that kind of moves more or less along their lines, and so it could be a helpful supplement for some.
Okay, well, listeners, if you have not started listening to Two-Age Sojourner yet, then your assignment for this week is to go get yourself subscribed to that podcast. And I hope you do look into New Zealand and maybe reach out to Mike. Mike, thank you so much for joining us this week. I really, really appreciated the conversation.
Man, been a total honor. Total honor to sit in the seat of Todd Bordeaux. Whoa. I mean, that's going to stay with me for a while.
Well,
thank you, Todd.
The honor was mine to have you on. So
great.
Well, dear listener, we would love to know what you think, so please do email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us. I am at MachinGuy. Todd is at tbordeaux. The podcast itself is at glorycloudpod. But you can also join us over at the Meredith Kline Facebook group. Just let the admins know that you listen to the podcast and they can get you added. And Todd and I will be back again next week with more Meredith Kline and the church.